So Ivermectin is back in the news. Well, it's back on social media anyways. A lot of people are talking about it again. And of course, we remember this from back in the COVID days, which wasn't that long ago. And, people were bringing up this compound, this medication. And I think most people hadn't heard of it before, especially in North America and most of the Western world. And, why? Well, because it's kind of specific to parasitic diseases. It's actually been around a while. It's actually associated with the Nobel Prize, but it's not something that was on most people's minds. And then you heard about it because some people, and I don't know how they discovered this, but they thought that maybe it would be good for treating COVID. COVID, right? Got this virus. We've got this anti-parasitic compound and very well known and established and award-winning medication called Ivermectin. People made the connection, and some people thought that as they took it, they were getting, reduced symptoms or getting over their COVID. So you kind of had two camps here, right? You had the people on the one side that said, yes, this is like a medication. This is a medicine that people need to be talking about. It's actually kind of being suppressed for whatever reason. Maybe because the pharmaceutical companies are not pushing it. Maybe it's because it's off patent. There's no financial incentive, whatever. It's this thing that's being suppressed, whereas this other medicine, right, the vaccines that are coming out is obviously being pushed. And so you kind of had the camp that was like, yeah, that's the only reason it's being suppressed. They're actually pushing the vaccines, whatever. And then you have the other side, which is saying, no, this is all just part of COVID misinformation, and obviously the whole thing got political, and you can kind of choose which camp you want to go in, or maybe you kind of sit somewhere in the middle, or maybe you just don't care. But that was ivermectin during COVID, and now it's being talked about again. And the reason why it's being talked about again is not because of viruses or anything like that. It's because of cancer. And some people think, that ivermectin might actually be something worth looking into as a treatment for, or even a cure for cancer or types of cancer. So you've got the two camps popping up again. Is this misinformation? Is this just ridiculous? Are people putting their hopes in something? It's obviously just going to get political again because it's very fresh, recent memory about all the COVID stuff, and that's just the society we live in. So what's the reality here, right? It's popping up again. Now it's not about COVID. Now it's about something else. Well, maybe it is good for that. Is it good for cancer? Should we be looking at it? Is it still being suppressed? Whatever. So let's de-hype it. Let's talk about the science. Let's get into it. Give you a proper way to think about this so you can know where it stands, and then you can kind of decide for yourself. I'll give you something at the end that's actually just better than choosing one side or the other. Just think about how essentially medication and discovery and this kind of science works in general. So everybody, regardless of which side, which camp they're in, which tribe they're going to associate themselves with, they're all basically kind of reacting to a real story. Like something is real in there, right? And so what do I mean by that? Well, yes, it's true that ivermectin is very much an established real medication. So it's not just like horse dewormer. People kind of do the gaslighting on that. It's a lot more than that. It's actually been around for some time. It's associated with the Nobel Prize. It's very much a cure for certain types of diseases that are parasitic, essentially. So certain parasitic diseases, there's been a ton of success around the world in applying ivermectin to that and getting people past that. So that is true. So there's a real medication. It's not like just some random thing a veterinarian would use. It has nothing to do with humans. No, it very much is associated with humans. It has real activity. We've had a lot of success with it for parasitic diseases, right? It's also, so that's true. And then it's also true that it was absolutely overhyped during COVID, right? Not saying anything about whether or not it had any efficacy there. It was just really, really overhyped, as though it was this kind of miracle thing, and it was only being suppressed, and you had to, and we'll get into some of the kind of, a little bit into the larger randomized controlled trials that were done to see if there was an association between the ivermectin and COVID symptoms, and we'll see that there wasn't actually much. So yeah, that was definitely overhyped. Real medication, yes. Overhyped, yes. It's also true, bringing it back to, which is the new thing now, the cancer stuff, that there is real lab results associating ivermectin with cancer, okay? This is kind of petri dish stuff, maybe small animal model stuff, very limited. That's real, but it's also true that that's absolutely not proven to work in humans or to be anything that's necessarily viable as a treatment for human cancers. Okay, so when I say, regardless of what camp you're in, you or other people, they're reacting to a real story. It's not like somebody's just inventing this thing. And the lab results of ivermectin in the cancer, that type of research is genuinely interesting. It's just that there's this big translation being made, this big leap from that. And I'll talk about this happens all the time. Of course, I just use these as examples, right? The ivermectin will be the example in this episode of a broader problem with the way the general public tends to treat research, and quite frankly, sometimes scientists as well. The way that they'll make a discovery. Discoveries are actually pretty cheap, right? But then they'll transfer that to something that's a much broader claim about, the ability of an effect to take place in the human body, and that's just not the case. Doesn't mean it couldn't be, but it's not the case, and you really got to know that difference. This is a good example of that. So this is not really about, is ivermectin good or bad, right? And getting all political about it, and people squash everything down to a single claim. Is it good? Is it bad? It's not a yes or no thing, right? We've got this kind of battlefield. What ivermectin is representing is essentially a battlefield of what counts as proper evidence, right? As we'll see. And it's actually a bit of a failed battlefield in terms of the COVID stuff, right? And now it's coming up again in the cancer stuff. It's failed, not really scientifically, but it's failed culturally, right? Like the culture, and you could kind of just say that about COVID in general, regardless of what real science happened, what the real results were, whether you're talking about vaccines or you're talking about ivermectin, culturally, right? Stepping back, everybody just kind of feels, unless you're a scientist doing the research, that, yeah, we don't really know at the end of the day. What was the true efficacy of the vaccines? What was the true ability of, let's say, something like ivermectin? Culturally, I'm not saying scientifically, but culturally, we can all step back and kind of shrug our shoulders and be like, I don't know, right? Because there was so much noise there. There was genuine misinformation, but there was also genuine science that was just overhyped, regardless of which camp you were in. It was pushed a lot. So culturally, that kind of battlefield just kind of dissolved and didn't really go anywhere. And I think that's how people feel about COVID in general, right? Now, scientifically, as I was saying, there are true large randomized controlled trials, kind of golden standard stuff that was done on ivermectin and seeing if it had any effect on COVID. And the general result there was that, yeah, not really. Not a lot. Okay, that's just where the research stands, regardless of whether you agree with it or not, right? Scientifically, I think a lot of scientists would feel that it is settled. Essentially, settled is a bit strong of a word, but this idea that ivermectin was going to be a good medication for something like COVID, right? So this is a good case study in essentially the repurposing of drugs, because again, now we're going from the COVID stuff to cancer. So now it's in the news again, people are talking about it again. It's also a good case study in institutional trust, or the lack thereof. Okay, a lot of institutional trust got eroded during COVID, and that still stays with us today. Again, it wasn't that long ago. It might even be a little bit worse, if possible, than it was in COVID. Okay. There's all kinds of political bias. It's a good case study for that. It's a case study for financial incentives, and really just a good case study in the gap that exists between what actually gets discovered in the lab and then what is possible in humans, right? And I think that is the conversation we have to understand something like ivermectin when it's in the news. You can be political if you want. You can do whatever. You can join your tribe. But at some point, you got to step back and say, yeah, what is the actual science, right? Again, I like to say, if you're going to make an argument, the structure, there is such a thing as a structure of an argument. You have premises which connect to conclusions, and the premises have to be based on, actual evidence or what the science actually says. Even if you end up drawing a different conclusion from that, at least get those premises standard and understood. And that's kind of what I hope this episode will help some of you if you don't already know at this point. Okay, so the big thing here, again, is this repurposing, right? It was ivermectin for COVID. Now it's all about maybe it could be used for cancer. Amidst all that is still, like I said, this lack of institutional trust. It's just not there. So it's interesting, right? Because ivermectin has kind of become, it's not even about the drug anymore. It's not even about the science almost. From a cultural perspective, it's become kind of a stand-in. Essentially, it's become a proxy war for, again, what counts as evidence in science? What is real? What's not? What are people supposed to believe? What are they supposed to latch onto when they go to make their arguments? And especially if something like ivermectin were available to you, whether that's during COVID or if somebody you knew or yourself were going through a deadly disease, you would want to know the truth, right? And, let's just be honest, there is such a thing as some level of suppression. That's not a conspiracy theory. I don't even think people are trying to be malicious. I think if you have financial incentives to grow a company, then that's going to be the push you do. Those are going to be the muscles you flex. And that might come across as almost a type of suppression, but it's almost more people are just cherry picking what they believe in and they're pushing on that angle, right? That can just be expected. So maybe if you're going through something, you'd be like, well, I want to know if there is an alternative treatment. I think that is perfectly rational, but to continue to be rational and continue to drive that home, you have to have a good understanding of what is real. Let's take a look at the actual science itself, right, to some extent, as much as you can. And you can, like laymen can do this, right? It's not, if you just, we can't just trust the institutions at this point because the institutional trust isn't there. And that's not me saying you shouldn't trust the institutions. I'm just saying culturally we know that's the case. And so it's not going to be easy for a lot of people to just take what is said by, a healthcare institution or the doctors or the scientists. And even then, people can interpret some of those results differently, right? So ivermectin has become this kind of almost cultural symbol of this proxy war that people are having about what really counts as evidence, right? But generally speaking, yeah, the scientists, the doctors, the institutions, they come forward, and like I said, when it comes to the COVID stuff, that was definitely overhyped, and it doesn't look like it has much. In fact, and you got to remember that you may have taken it yourself, or somebody, and maybe they got over their COVID symptoms, but that's anecdotal, right? Statistically, you can't say that you don't know that it actually had an effect. And that kind of sounds obvious, right? Like random things happen all the time. Remember the last episode, right? Talking about p-values, right? And how randomness can make it look like something is statistically significant when it's not. The kind of layman human version of doing that is basically, you notice something in your own life, you notice a pattern, and you kind of generalize it out as a universal rule. It might be, but that's just you. And that might even just be a few people This is why large randomized controlled trials, these statistical studies happen, because the whole point is to get away from the anecdotal stuff, the stuff that looks like patterns to the everyday person, and figure out if it actually is a pattern, if it's real, right? At the end of the day, a petri dish is not the same thing as a human trial, right? And a lot of these results come, and you see this all the time, right? It's not, this is the ivermectin example. It could be something like turmeric is really good for fighting Alzheimer's. Well, is it? Well, there's probably that is not a fact. There might be some studies out there that looked at associations, and maybe petri dish level stuff was noticing something associated with Alzheimer's was kind of remedied or mitigated somehow with the presence of turmeric. Then you start looking into it deeper, and you might find, well, the turmeric was actually at a higher concentration than anybody would ever be able to take, so it doesn't even apply. And that actually comes into the ivermectin stuff in a bit. And I don't know if that was a real study, but it's that kind of thing that happens all the time, right? The dosage is not really something that's available to humans. Maybe, but you can push back on that a bit. You might say, well, maybe one day it will be, but the petri dish is not the same as the human. The mouse is not the same as the human, and you get a lot of kind of bro science out of there on these influencers on social media that constantly push stuff. They'll find some little association. They'll point to a paper and they say, well, look, that's science. And it was a genuine discovery, but it had nothing to do with the bioavailability in a human body. It might be associated, but who knows? Or even if it was a small human study, it was probably very small. You still have to be careful, but they draw these grand conclusions as though the science is settled and say, well, eat this root or take this powder or do this with a lifestyle or coffee or dark chocolate or red wine, and they make it like it's a fact. And I think a lot of people kind of call that bro science, right? And again, people are in some sense appealing to something real. It's not that there isn't real science there. It's just that they generalize and extend it all the way as though it's the number one thing. Even things like drinking water, right? Like, yeah, we should be drinking water. And maybe they can point to a study where higher water consumption was associated with better health, whatever that means. Like, what does better health mean? In the actual human body or in some kind of isolated biomarker that was assumed to be a proxy for better health? And then they supercharge it, and then they start pounding back a ton of water like this is the greatest thing. Maybe a little bit of sun is actually good for you, so then they never wear sunscreen. They go out and they bathe in the sun all the time. It's what we do as humans. We're really bad at finding the nuanced dosage, and we instead think that we kind of have to take one side or the other. We get extremely binary about it, very, very black or white about it, and we tend to supercharge little bits of evidence as though it's the truth. And that's just not how it works, right? Especially in science. So a big part of de-hyping science, and especially in this ivermectin space for this episode, is just understanding, like, step back. Just because there was a result doesn't mean this actually applies to humans. And even if it doesn't mean it applies to you, and on and on. There's levels, as we'll get into. But when it comes to ivermectin, right? Again, people are talking about it. The thing, when you apply it to something like cancer, right? COVID was COVID. Obviously, yeah, there was a lot of emotion and it was important in people's lives, but cancer's on a whole different level, right? It's extremely, extremely relatable to a lot of people. They know people, or it's themselves. It's an emotionally triggering thing. It's a very scary thing. It's one of those diseases that don't have a specific root cause. It's kind of those phantom jam type diseases, as I talked about in a few episodes back, right? It's super, super. It's got many faces to it, right? The emperor of all maladies, so to speak. And so this is like a whole new level of kind of triggering people and getting them interested, right? So if somebody comes out with the promise, it's like death, right? When people say, oh, maybe AI is going to help us reverse aging or make death a thing of the past. And there'll be some like little facet of truth kind of associated with it. And then people just start talking about it like it's fact. And it's because people are getting their hopes up, right? Obviously, right? Nobody wants to die. So they get their hopes up about stuff like that and they start sinking their teeth into it. So you've got social media influencers, you've got genuine patients going through things, right? And you've got institutions saying what they do. But, I think what a lot of people, especially on social media, are thinking with respect to ivermectin is that, look, this stuff is off patent, so the financial incentive isn't there for pharmaceutical companies, for example, to make much money off of it. And so maybe it's being suppressed, or this is why. And people are, on one hand, rightfully saying, look, if you just throw more money at this, let's find out, because there's been some promising results in let's say, cancer-related research and ivermectin, right? And so if you just throw more money, but the financial incentives are there, and in one hand, maybe if we threw an absolute ton of money at it, that we would find something, but statistically, there's a good chance that there won't be. And again, there's just a big difference between, I think people, they take a look at what are actually petri dish type studies or mice studies. They probably don't even know that's what the study is, because the headline isn't going to say that, right? And then they're probably not going to read the paper, right? And they just know something in science was done in a study related to mitigating cancer cell growth or something like this, and it involved ivermectin. All of a sudden, we need to look at this. This is super promising, and even though there's zero proof whatsoever that it works in humans, right? So going back to the institutional trust stuff, you got institutions and they're giving science results and making comments, and some people will see it as, okay, this is like scientific evidence, and other people will see it as this is just kind of political, right, stakes or something like that. And again, you get into the two camps, like what is it, right? If you don't even trust the institutions and what they're saying, maybe you don't even trust what I'm saying right now. Maybe you think I've got some incentive to take a side, even though I'm not actually taking a side here, right? So the reality is that, the people who are for ivermectin and looking at it for a potential cancer treatment are really, they're overstating the evidence. Doesn't mean there is none. Doesn't mean there's not genuine science, but they're definitely overstating the science, and it's important for you to know that. The people who are against ivermectin, you could say, right, and push it away, in many ways they're understating the uncertainty, right? It's not settled, right? Just because if you have all these RCT studies that were done on, COVID, that's not really anything to do necessarily with cancer. And just because the petri dish is not the same thing as a human body doesn't mean there's no potential there. So you got people overstating and understating, and this is just what humans do, right? What's actually happening here is that people are treating ivermectin as though it's a single claim, okay? And the reality is, again, ivermectin is a super, super successful medication, super successful drug, right? A super successful compound for certain parasitic diseases, right? It's not true that it's a super good one for all of them. It is true that there's been some exciting lab results in associating ivermectin with cancer. It's also true that there's absolutely no proof that it's going to have any efficacy whatsoever in the human body. And it's just true that all of this is kind of, people are collapsing everything down to a single claim, which is ivermectin is good or bad. And so you're not even having a real conversation, right? Very few people are saying, if you say ivermectin is good, then the question is, well, good for what? At what dose? Right? At what level of evidence? And what you have is the two camps basically talking to each other in taking on a really simplified version of what the other person's stance is, right? Like you just think it's bad, you're suppressing it. You think it's good, you're doing misinformation, right? You take this kind of really stupid, oversimplified version of the opponent's view, right? And then you're just talking past each other and nothing really happens. So medicine proper, like actual medicine, right, is something that has different levels of evidence. And the general public collapsing that down to a single claim, it's good or bad, is really problematic. What are those different types of evidence? Like, what exists in medicine? Well, you have even, let's say, mechanistic theories before even anything happens in the lab. And then you have cell studies, let's say petri dish type stuff. You'll have animal studies. You'll have, let's say, smaller human trials. You'll have large randomized controlled trials, right? And eventually you'll get into full-blown, let's say, meta-analyses. But you have all these different versions of where the evidence could lie. So going back to when people make arguments, if you're going to argue for or against ivermectin, at what level of evidence are you even talking about, right? If you say, well, I'm totally against the use of ivermectin and it's totally misinformation, we shouldn't be associating with cancer at all. Well, that's a bit nonsense, because at the very least, there's some petri dish type studies that do show some kind of promise, and that's real science. But also, if you're the person pushing ivermectin and saying, well, it's all just being suppressed and doesn't have a financial incentive, and we already know it's absolutely a treatment for cancer, well, that's also not true. You don't know that. Again, petri dish, maybe a few mice studies here and there, right? Small animal model stuff. There's absolutely no proof that it's going to work in humans. And the important thing is to understand that this is how science works all the time. Like, the majority of petri dish type stuff is not going to work in humans, like just statistically, right? The majority of evidence that exists at one of those levels, one of those, whether that's theoretical cell culture stuff, small animal model, even small human population stuff, randomized controlled trial, right? Just because it exists in one does not mean it's going to translate into the other. It doesn't mean it's going to translate into something in the real world, which is really what it's all about. And the majority of the science in medicine is about that translation actually not occurring, because that's science. Most of it fails. You try something, it shows some promise, which is why you continue to look at it, and then the promise fades away. And every once in a while, it does survive reality. And of course, that's how we move things forward. So everybody is kind of camping at one level of evidence without realizing that that's what they're doing. The person who is really promoting ivermectin, we need to look at this, is looking at some promising results in a petri dish somewhere and talking about it as though this thing has been proven, and what, this is ridiculous that we're not funding it more, and that people are almost to the point that it should just be administered, or if you're going through this, go seek it out and take it, right? Or they're capping out on the other side, like I said, right? The evidence is very scant, but then they suggest that there's no promise whatsoever. Okay, so know the evidence. Know that, what does the evidence actually say? Know what it is. Yes, it is a real medication, Nobel Prize winning association. It's for specific parasitic diseases, not all of them, some of them, lots of success there. There are real lab results related to cancer, but it's petri dish type stuff, maybe small animal model type stuff, nothing to do with proving that it works in the human body, right? So understand where you're camping, understand what the evidence says, and then just have a realistic opinion about it going forward. The thing that people have to realize is that discovery in science is actually pretty cheap, right? Like, the general public looks at a discovery and they think something has happened. Right? This has been discovered. Discovery is cheap. Discovery happens all the time, because discovery, nobody discovered that ivermectin worked in the human body. They discovered, let's say, something in a petri dish that happened to be associated with cancer. That's a real discovery. It's exciting. It's super interesting. That's it. That itself is a bit cheap, because translating that to something that has efficacy in the real body is a completely different story. Maybe someday it'll happen. You really, really don't know. Statistically, it probably won't, but it still could. Again, just when I say statistically, is because discovery is cheap and most stuff goes nowhere. Discovery is happening in a very isolated, myopic thing, because that's what lab studies are, right? Somebody creates a very contrived, artificial environment in the lab that doesn't have much to do with reality, quite frankly, right? Because you're operating in a vacuum, you're stripping out all the real world complexities, you do something just super, super reductionist and isolated, and in that little world, something happens. Now, that can be genuine science, and that can be super interesting, but that's what it is. Translating that to something that's going to happen in the real world, in a massively complex human body with countless interacting factors, It's a completely different story, and it almost never happens, but sometimes it does. So discovery is cheap. The translation to reality is expensive. Okay, we really got to know that. So that's what it's about. And I think indeed, when you look at articles like this and you get people talking and chirping back and forth, understand we're probably talking past each other. People are talking at different levels of evidence. Step back. What is actually there? What's real? And understand that what really matters when it comes to improving the quality of human life is the translation of cheap discovery to something that actually survives reality, which almost never happens. Sometimes it does. Maybe it still makes sense to put your faith in it. Maybe it makes sense to push more on it and say there should be some studies, there should be more whatever. But getting conspiratorial about it isn't going to help because it's usually based on nonsense, and completely ignoring the possibility that it could be good is just as unrealistic. Understand where you're camping, understand what studies actually say, and push on that. And I think at the end of the day, we need to get the point where, one type of evidence stops pretending to be a different type of evidence, right? So we need to be more precise about what we're talking about, right? So anytime something comes up like this, anytime somebody makes a claim, first of all, they're probably squashing a whole bunch of levels of evidence down to a single claim, which is unrealistic. So when someone makes a claim, ivermectin was shown to do this, there's no way ivermectin can do that. But let's say it's a positive thing. Ivermectin can do this, right? It's been shown. You say, well, it was shown where? It was shown for what? It was shown at what dose, right? What did the study say? What was the, and then you can get more into like, how big was the sample size? But just that, like at what dose and where, even just the where, meaning like, what was this in a mouse? Was this in a petri dish? Was this actually a human trial? Was this a large randomized controlled trial? Was this a big meta-analysis that compared a bunch of different RCT studies that actually found true correlation? What was there? Where did it happen? 99% of the time, it's going to be some little petri dish thing. Doesn't mean it's not interesting, but watch your claims or the person asking you or what you're trying to believe in. You got to be able to hype that stuff. You got to know that there's different levels of evidence. You got to know which ones say what. You don't need to be a scientist to do that. Just figure out what's real, what's being claimed. Don't squash everything down to a single claim. And then you'll be a lot, smarter in making decisions about this. So, a lot of people are talking about ivermectin. I just wanted to bring that up. It's kind of in the social media again, and people are chirping about it. And I don't know, maybe there really is something there for cancer, but the level of evidence has nothing to do with it actually working in humans currently. So don't talk about it like it does, right? Have realistic conversations. You got to have real conversations first before you can have conversations that actually have any sense to them, and before funding or whatever is maybe going to be motivated and taken off in a good direction. All right, that's it for this episode. Thanks everyone for listening. And for those of you who are watching, go ahead and check out dekyon.io, dekyon.io, so you can learn more about the science that I talk about. You can ask AI questions about it. The AI is aware of all the different episodes and the concept maps that have been built for these episodes. So it's not just like using ChatGPT or Claude. It's very specific to the type of stuff, kind of fine-tuned, if you will, on this material. So it's a really, really good companion for learning science. It's okay if you're a layman. It's okay if some of this gets a little jargony for you. The tools can help you. You've got data visualization concept maps. You've got study centers. You've got the ability to turn these episodes into techniques so that you can use these patterns in your everyday life. There's a forum on there for chatting and all that good stuff. So $9.99 a month. Go ahead and check that out. Okay, everyone, until the next one, take care.